Hello there, I'm Lady Loy, and I'm starting a book. Well, I'm writing a book, and it's called Everything You Need to Know About Blackness But Was Afraid to Ask. And I've kind of simplified all of these technical concepts. So I'm reading it, well, I'm doing a video on it, and I hope you'll find it interesting, and we'll pass it on. So I think this is going to be, I'm going to have to say this one quite fast because I've only got 10 minutes, so I'm not going to babble on. So this is about scientific racism. Sometimes the most dangerous stories aren't shouted, they're whispered. They arrive dressed in logic, wearing the language of reason, measurement, and just the facts. And that's what makes scientific racism so unsettling, because it didn't come at people with open hatred at first. It came with rulers, charts, calipers, and numbers, with the quiet authority of men in lab coats saying, "This isn't opinion, this is science." And once something is framed as science, it becomes very hard to argue with, especially if you're the one being measured. Scientific racism is the attempt to use science to rank human beings, to claim that intelligence, morality, worth, or destiny can be read off a skull, a nose, or the shade of skin. It was about justification, explaining why some people could be enslaved, colonised, exploited, or erased without guilt. It answered a moral problem with false biological excuse. If we experiment with the perspective for a moment and step back into the minds of those early centuries, we can see how this story took hold. Empires were expanding, wealth was flowing in one direction. Violence towards slaves and free black people was being committed on such a scale that needed explanation. And so a question emerged that was never asked honestly. How do we live with ourselves while doing this? Scientific racism offered a solution. It said, these people are not like you. They're not fully human in the same way, not capable of the same thought, the same feeling, the same civilization, and suddenly cruelty could sleep at night. Real science starts with a question and follows evidence wherever it leads. However, scientific racism starts with a conclusion and works backwards to defend it. Measurements were taken only when they confirmed existing beliefs. Contradictions were ignored. This was data performing obedience. But the damage didn't stay in textbooks or museums. It spilled into law, education, medicine, housing, borders. It shaped who was believed, who was protected, who was allowed to fail, and who was punished for surviving. And perhaps most painfully, it taught generations of people to internalize lies about themselves, to doubt their intelligence, to question their beauty, to shrink their dreams, to fit someone else's measurement. And yet, even after these ideas were discredited, they didn't vanish. They simply learned a new language. They dressed themselves in what some call biological realism, a phrase that sounds neutral, careful, scientific, almost reasonable, and yet underneath it carries same old assumptions that some people are naturally more capable, more valuable, more worthy than others. Biological realism presents itself as an honest discussion, as realism, as cautious science, but in practice, it often cherry picks data, ignores environment, and softens the moral alarm so that fear and division can quietly persist. It allows old hierarchies to linger in new forms without the overt rhetoric of bygone centuries. And yet, even today, when we see black excellence all around us in scientists, writers, leaders, artists, and everyday people making a difference, there are still stories being whispered that try to convince some that this is unusual, that this is an exception, not the rule. The truth is right in front of our eyes, but a small but persistent ideology works quietly, not by shouting lies, but by shaping how people interpret what they see. Success is reframed as anomaly. Brilliance is explained away as luck, and patterns of achievement are ignored unless they fit the old story. It's not that black excellence doesn't exist. It does, abundantly, but this subtle programming, reinforced through media, jokes, selective narratives, and coded language like biological realism, attempts to override perception and maintain fear, hierarchy, and control. Reality is undeniable, but the story is carefully bent, so some people can keep believing that inequality is natural, even when evidence says otherwise. Modern genetics has proven that race doesn't determine ability or worth. There's more difference between people in the same racial group than between people of different groups. Things like intelligence, creativity, or resilience aren't tied to skin colour. And yet, old ideas still linger in the assumptions we make, the rules we create, and whose struggles are taken seriously. Scientific racism didn't disappear, it changed its language. It now hides behind phrases like biological realism or misused statistics. It pops up when inequality needs to be explained away without addressing power or history. It becomes useful again whenever systems don't want to take responsibility. There's an unusual way to approach this, and it's one we don't often give space to. It's shame. Not the shame of those who were harmed, but the unspoken shame of societies that inherited these lies. Scientific racism asks us to face an uncomfortable truth, that intelligence was weaponized, that knowledge was corrupted, that progress was built alongside profound injustice. Avoiding that shame allows the story to repeat itself. Sitting with it allows something else to emerge: accountability. So how do we address the elephant in the room? It's not by asking who is smarter or better, not is asking who is smarter or better, but what am I afraid of losing when the world changes? Often the fear is not of other people, but of power, status, of recognition. Tracing the fear back helps separate real anxiety from imagined threats. Another way of trying to look at this differently is looking at across time. Every generation that panicked about being replaced has still gone on to leave descendants, stories, music, language, memory. Nothing vanished. It's simply changed shape. When we talk about solutions, the obvious one feels almost too simple to say out loud, but it's to tell the truth. Not just the polished version, but the full story. Teach how science was misused alongside what real science actually shows. Teach doubt as strength, not a threat. Teach people how to recognize when authority is being used to silence rather than enlighten. Is there a resolve? One is slowing down. Scientific racism and biological realism thrive on certainty, on the idea that complex human lives can be reduced to neat categories. Slowing down allows nuance to breathe. Another possibility is restoring humanity to education, allowing stories, voices, and lived experiences to sit alongside data rather than being dismissed as subjective. And perhaps the most uncomfortable solution of all is humility, accepting that intelligence does not belong to institutions alone, that wisdom lives in places that were never given laboratories. Because here's the thing, we don't often say enough. Scientific racism didn't fail because it was challenged by kindness. It failed because it wasn't true. Reality refused to cooperate. People continued to create, love, build, survive, think, imagine, despite being told they couldn't. And that quiet defiance is one of the most powerful rebukes to false science there is. So if you're listening, wondering why it matters, why we keep returning to these stories, it's because the past doesn't stay past unless it's understood. Scientific racism and its modern cousin biological realism reminds us that intelligence without ethics is dangerous, that facts without humility can become weapons, and that science, like any human tool, reflects the values of the hands that hold it. This isn't about guilt, it's about responsibility, about choosing curiosity over certainty, humanity over hierarchy, truth over comfort. People are complex, contradictory, brilliantly flawed, and no ruler, no chart, no study misused as authority has ever been able to measure that properly. And I hope, even though I said that quite quickly, it made sense. Bye bye. Thank you for listening.